There is a man in Mexico right now who people say owns an entire mountain. Not a house on a mountain, not a ranch near a mountain, an entire stretch of the Sierra Madre Occidental, so vast, so fortified, and so completely controlled by his armed network that the Mexican military has flown helicopters over it dozens of times and still cannot reach him. His name is Alfredo Guzman Salazar. The criminal world knows him as El Alfredillo. And the empire he has built out there in those mountains, the hidden ranches, the clandestine airstrips, the armed lookout posts on every ridge, the fortified compounds tucked into valleys that don't appear on any government map, is so deeply embedded into that landscape that U.S. law enforcement officials have openly described portions of his territory as effectively outside the control of the Mexican state. The DEA is hunting him. The Department of Justice has indicted him. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned him. And the American government is right now offering $10 million to anyone who can point them to where he sleeps tonight. But here is what almost nobody tells you. El Alfredillo has not survived by hiding. He has survived by operating. According to security analysts, investigative journalists who have spent decades documenting the Sinaloa cartel, and law enforcement officials on both sides of the border, he is right now coordinating one of the most lethal and profitable drug trafficking operations in the history of organized crime. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioid responsible for more than 100,000 American overdose deaths every single year. The counterfeit pills turning up in high schools and college dorms and apartments in every American city. That supply chain allegedly runs through the organization El Alfredillo commands from inside those mountains. And the cartel behind it, the Sinaloa cartel, the empire his father El Chapo built from nothing, is still generating billions, while every law enforcement agency on the continent tries and fails to stop it. But I assure you the real story, the one that explains how a man becomes so untouchable that people describe him like a force of nature rather than a fugitive, lies in details the media has never quite put together in one place. The childhood. The education his father gave him in the mountains. The specific path that turned him from El Chapo's son into one of the principal architects of the global fentanyl trade. Because most people hear Los Chapitos and think the story is simple. Born into the cartel, handed an empire. But amidst the kidnappings, the power struggles, the captures of his own brothers, and the near total collapse of the cartel order his father built, El Alfredillo tightened his grip using one thing. One asset that his father passed down to him before the walls closed in forever. One inheritance that his enemies cannot bomb, cannot arrest, and cannot take. And understanding what that one thing is and how he used it is what this video is really about. 'Cause the story of how El Alfredillo built his mountain empire is far more unbelievable than most people realize. But before we get into who he became, I need you to first understand who raised him and where. 'Cause without that foundation, none of what follows makes any sense. Alfredo Guzman Salazar grew up in a world that most people only encounter in documentaries. His father, Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera, known globally as El Chapo, was not simply a criminal. By the time Alfredo was old enough to understand anything about the world around him, his father had already transformed the Sinaloa cartel from a regional smuggling outfit operating out of dirt road mountain towns into what the U.S. government would eventually call the most powerful drug trafficking organization on the planet. El Chapo had built tunnels under the U.S. border. He had established submarine routes through the Pacific. He had corrupted officials at every level of the Mexican government. He had built logistics networks that moved cocaine, heroin, and marijuana into American cities at volumes that completely overwhelmed the DEA's ability to respond. And he had done most of it from the mountains of Sinaloa. the same mountains where his son Alfredo was growing up. El Chapo was born in 1957 in a small mountain village called La Tuna in the municipality of Badiraguato, deep in the Sierra Madre Occidental. And to understand El Alfredillo, you have to understand La Tuna first. Because the village his father came from was not just a backdrop, it was a blueprint for everything that followed. La Tuna had no paved roads when El Chapo was a child, no electricity. The nearest city, Culiacan, was hours away on dirt tracks that became impassable in the rainy season. The economy was subsistence farming and, increasingly, the cultivation of marijuana and opium poppies that had been grown in those mountains since at least the 1940s, when the region first became a supply source for American drug markets. El Chapo dropped out of school after third grade. He started working in poppy fields as a boy. By his teenage years, he was running small loads of marijuana for local traffickers. By his 20s, he had caught the attention of Miguel Ángel Flix Gallardo, the godfather of the modern Mexican drug trade, who brought him into the Guadalajara cartel organization and gave him his first real operational responsibilities. El Chapo had multiple families across his life. Jess Alfredo was born to Griselda Elpez Prez, one of El Chapo's wives and the mother of several of his children, including Ivan Archivaldo and El Alfredillo. Griselda came from the Sierra herself, from a family embedded in the same mountain culture that produced El Chapo. She raised her children in Sinaloa during years when her husband was either a fugitive, imprisoned, or somewhere between the two. El Alfredillo grew up in this specific reality, a mother holding the family together in the mountains while his father's name dominated every news channel in Mexico and every dia briefing in Washington. Being El Chapo's son was not an abstraction. It was the defining fact of daily existence from the first moment anyone outside the family knew who you were. El Chapo visited when he could. When he was a fugitive, those visits required the kind of security protocols that became second nature to everyone around him. No phones near the meeting location. Advanced scouts deployed on all approach roads hours in advance. Trusted drivers vetted over years of loyalty. Location changes at the last minute. Meetings held outdoors, away from buildings, in places where electronic surveillance would struggle to penetrate. Everyone in El Chapo's orbit, including his children, lived inside this security architecture. El Alfredillo grew up knowing that the men who came to visit arrived in convoys with weapons visible in the truck beds. That certain conversations only happened outside, never indoors. That some faces he recognized from childhood were never spoken about in front of strangers. And that the ordinary rules of ordinary life simply did not apply to his world. This was not traumatic for him the way it might have been for a child from a different background. It was simply normal. It was the texture of home. This is the man who raised El Alfredillo, not a distant criminal kingpin living in a penthouse somewhere. A man who came from nothing in those mountains, who knew every trail and every family in the Sierra, and who was present in his children's lives in the specific way that mountain ranching culture in Sinaloa has always structured family life, through land, through animals, through the daily rhythms of rural existence that happen to overlap completely with cartel operations. El Alfredillo's childhood was spent on ranches, real working ranches with horses and cattle, but also ranches where trusted cartel veterans came and went, where conversations about logistics and security and territory happened in the open because everyone present was either family or loyal. The ranch was the office. The mountains were the classroom. Growing up in this environment meant the cartel was never an abstraction for El Alfredillo. It was simply the landscape, and the landscape shaped him in ways that a childhood in a city, even a dangerous city, simply could not have. Mountain children in the Sierra develop a specific kind of spatial intelligence, an instinctive understanding of terrain, of how distance and elevation and vegetation interact with visibility and vulnerability, of which ridge gives you observation and which canyon gives you concealment. El Alfredillo grew up with that spatial intelligence, trained on a landscape that was simultaneously his backyard and the operational backbone of his family's criminal enterprise. He did not learn to read mountains from a tactical manual. He learned by living in them. He also learned trust in the specific way that isolated communities develop it, slowly through shared history, through demonstrated loyalty across circumstances that tested it, through the understanding that in a world where betrayal was a death sentence, the only trustworthy people were those whose reliability had been proven over years rather than merely claimed. This is a form of social intelligence that proves extraordinarily valuable when you are eventually running an organization where one wrong placement of trust can end your freedom or your life. El Alfredillo absorbed this intelligence from the people around him before he was old enough to articulate it. The region where he was raised, the area where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua converge in the Sierra Madre, known as the Golden Triangle, had been the center of Mexican drug cultivation for generations before he was born. Marijuana fields and poppy plantations covered hillsides that had grown them for decades. The men who managed those fields, who loaded the mules, who drove the trucks, who staffed the security checkpoints on the mountain roads, those were the neighbors, the employees, the extended community of El Alfredillo's childhood. Corrido music celebrated them. Local oral history preserved their stories. The economy of those mountain communities was built around what they did. A boy growing up in that world did not need to be recruited into the cartel. He was born into it the same way a farmer's son is born into farming. But what distinguished El Alfredillo and his brothers from ordinary cartel children was the specific deliberateness with which El Chapo prepared them. According to reporting by journalists who spent years inside the Sinaloa story, including Anabel Hernandez, whose investigative work on El Chapo is among the most detailed ever published. El Chapo was unusually intentional about succession in a world where most drug lords made no such plans. He did not simply expose his sons to cartel life and let them absorb it. He arranged for trusted veterans of his organization, men who had managed specific operational functions for years, to teach his boys how those functions actually worked. Not in classrooms, on the ranches, in the mountain compounds, during the actual work. How drug shipments are coordinated across long distances. How money moves from street sales back to organizational leadership without getting caught. How security operations are structured to protect a principal. How you read a landscape for tactical advantage. How alliances are built with rivals and with government officials. How you know who to trust and who is already talking to the other side. El Alfredillo was reportedly absorbing this education through his teenage years and into his 20s, while his father's organization was at the peak of its power. This was the early 2000s, when El Chapo had escaped from Puente Grande maximum security prison in January 2001 in a laundry cart, or, as many investigators believe, simply walked out through a side door with the cooperation of paid guards and returned to the Sierra to rebuild. The organization he rebuilt after that escape became more sophisticated, more ruthless, and more global than anything he had run before. El Alfredillo was watching all of it and, increasingly, participating in it. Now here is where things get interesting. 'Cause the transition from El Chapo student to genuine operational figure did not happen through any single dramatic moment. It happened the way all real power transitions happen, gradually, through demonstrated competence in specific functions, and through the slow accumulation of personal relationships with the people who actually make an organization run. El Alfredillo was not handed a title. he earned a function. In the cartel world, titles mean nothing if you cannot actually make things happen. What matters is whether the people who drive the trucks, manage the money, command the security teams, and coordinate the logistics respect your authority enough to act on it without needing your father to back you up. That kind of authority is built over years of showing up, making decisions, and being right often enough that the people around you start looking to you first instead of going around you. This is what El Alfredillo was doing throughout the mid-2000s and into the 2010s, while El Chapo was running from the law and occasionally getting caught. When El Chapo was recaptured in February 2014 in Mazatlan, in a military and DIA operation that found him in a condo through months of patient intelligence work, his sons were not idle. They were actively managing portions of the organization's operations in Sinaloa. El Chapo escaped from Altiplano Maximum Security Prison in July 2015 through a tunnel that was dug by his organization over an extended period. A 1-mile-long tunnel with a motorcycle on rails to move him out, ventilated and lit, entering the prison through the floor of his cell shower. The engineering was extraordinary, and the operation required months of coordination, bribery of prison officials, and logistical support that involved people connected to his sons. When El Chapo was finally recaptured in January 2016 in Los Mochis after a military raid, and then extradited permanently to the United States in January 2017, his sons had already been functioning as genuine operational managers for several years. The transition to full leadership was not a sudden handoff. It was a formalization of something already underway. By the early 2010s, with El Chapo again a fugitive after his second arrest and release, the Sinaloa cartel was operating at a scale that required genuine organizational management across multiple departments: trafficking logistics, financial operations, security, communications, political relationships, procurement of weapons and equipment. Each of these functions required trusted people to manage them, and El Chapo's sons were increasingly those people for specific areas. Even Archivaldo, the eldest, was reportedly more involved in the public-facing and alliance management aspects of operations. El Alfredillo's role, according to U.S. Treasury sanctions documentation and DIA investigative reporting, gravitated toward the operational and territorial. The physical infrastructure of the cartel, the ranches, the safe houses, the transportation networks, the security teams, was his domain. This made particular sense given his background. He had grown up in the mountains. He knew the terrain. He knew the people. He understood the geography of the Sierra in a way that could only come from having lived in it since childhood. When El Chapo needed someone to manage the operational backbone of the cartel's Sinaloa territory, the son who had spent his whole life on those ranches and mountain roads was the natural choice. El Chapo's final capture came in January 2016 in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, after a military operation that found him following years of intensive intelligence collection. He was extradited to New York in January 2017, tried in federal court in Brooklyn, and in February 2019 convicted on all counts: drug trafficking, murder conspiracy, money laundering, and more. The sentence was life plus 30 years, with no possibility of parole. He went to Adex Florence in Colorado, the most restrictive federal prison in the United States, and he has been there ever since. El Chapo was done. Permanently. For El Alfredillo and his brothers, this was not a moment of grief and retreat. It was a moment of succession. The organization their father had built was still intact, still generating billions, still operating across dozens of countries. Someone had to run it. And Los Chapitos, the group of El Chapo's sons who remained active in the cartel, stepped into that space with a speed and ambition that even veteran cartel watchers found striking. Los Chapitos refers specifically to 4 of El Chapo's sons: Even Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, the eldest, known as El Chapito, Jess Alfredo Guzman Salazar, El Alfredillo, Ovidio Guzman El Pez, known as El Ratna, the Mouse, who became internationally infamous in October 2019 when Mexican forces briefly arrested him in Culiacan and were then forced to release him after cartel gunmen took over the city, burned vehicles across major intersections, took soldiers hostage, and essentially held Culiacan under armed siege until the government backed down in what became known as the Culiacanazo, one of the most stunning demonstrations of cartel power over a state government in modern Mexican history. And Joaquin Guzmán Pez, known as El Hero, whose story took a dramatic and deeply complicated turn in 2024 that we will come back to. These four brothers did not simply maintain their father's organization, they transformed it. And the transformation they made, more than anything else, is why El Alfredillo specifically has become such a priority for American law enforcement. The old Sinaloa cartel was built on cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. These were agricultural products, or at least cocaine was a plant-derived product requiring supply chains from South America. Heroin required poppy cultivation in the Golden Triangle. Marijuana could be grown throughout Sinaloa. All of these products had been the cartel's core revenue sources for decades, and the infrastructure built around them, the Colombian supplier relationships, the border crossing systems, the distribution networks in American cities, was what El Chapo had spent 30 years constructing. Los Chapitos looked at that infrastructure and made a strategic decision that changed everything. They pivoted to fentanyl, not because anyone ordered them to, because the economics were simply incomparable to anything that had come before. You see, fentanyl is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine by weight. A kilogram of fentanyl pressed into counterfeit pills can generate revenue that would require many kilograms of heroin to match. The raw materials, precursor chemicals sourced primarily from suppliers in China, cost a fraction of what cultivating and processing poppies required. There was no growing season, no crop eradication vulnerability, no dependence on Colombian farmers or Andean geography. You bought chemicals, you ran a lab, you pressed pills, and you shipped them north. And the profit margins were extraordinary. But did any of that make the operation simpler? Nah. It made it more dangerous, more technically demanding, and more deeply connected to international supply chains that required an entirely new kind of organizational sophistication. Sourcing precursor chemicals from China required financial networks that operated across international borders. Processing fentanyl required chemistry knowledge and laboratory equipment that the cartel needed to acquire. Pressing counterfeit pills that looked convincingly like legitimate pharmaceuticals required specialized pressing machines and dyes. And all of this needed to happen inside secure facilities in territories that could not be raided by government forces. This is where El Alfredillo's role became critical. According to indictments from the Southern District of New York and Department of Justice documentation published in 2022 and 2023, his function within Los Chapitos centers on the physical operational infrastructure, the secure territories where production happens, the transportation networks that move product from labs to border crossing points, the security systems that protect all of it, the mountain strongholds of the Sierra Madre that serve as the operational backbone of the entire enterprise. To put that into context, the DEA has assessed that the Sinaloa cartel under Los Chapitos became the primary supplier of fentanyl to the United States market. In 2022 alone, more than 107,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. More than 2/3 of those deaths involved synthetic opioids. The math is brutal, and it points directly to the organization El Alfredillo allegedly helps run. The counterfeit pill operation is worth understanding in detail. because this is the specific product that defines what Los Chapitos built. The cartel presses fentanyl into pills designed to look exactly like legitimate prescription medications. The most common are M30 pills, tablets stamped with M on one side and 30 on the other, designed to look like 30 milligram oxycodone tablets that are legally manufactured by pharmaceutical companies. A person who has bought real prescription oxycodone before would look at these pills and see no obvious difference. The difference is what is inside. Real oxycodone comes in a consistent, precisely measured dose. Counterfeit M30s contain fentanyl in amounts that vary from pill to pill, depending on how thoroughly the pressing process mixed the active ingredient with the filler material. Some pills in a batch have almost no fentanyl. Some pills in the same batch have enough to kill. The buyer has no way to know which one they have picked up. The DEA seized more than 379 million fentanyl pills in 2022 alone. 379 million seized. The number that made it through to American consumers is, by definition, impossible to know, but the overdose statistics give you a rough sense of the scale. And every single one of those pills was manufactured somewhere, by someone, in a facility that required secure territory, equipment, chemicals, and organizational logistics to operate. That is what El Alfredillo's mountain empire is built to provide. Not just a hiding place for one man, a protected operational environment for an industrial-scale lethal manufacturing operation that has no parallel in the history of drug trafficking. Now here is where things get dark. 'Cause before El Alfredillo could fully consolidate his piece of this empire, something happened that shook the entire cartel world and nearly ended his story before it really started. In August 2016, El Alfredillo and his brother Ivan Archivaldo were at a restaurant in Puerto Vallarta. Puerto Vallarta is a resort city on the Pacific coast of Jalisco State, not Sinaloa cartel home territory. It sits in the middle of a region where the Jalisco New Generation cartel, known as the CJN, led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, had been aggressively expanding. The CJN at this point was the fastest-growing criminal organization in Mexico, built around a more overtly militarized model than the Sinaloa cartel's traditional approach, deploying organized tactical units with military weapons, including rocket-propelled grenades, and willing to conduct operations at a visibility that generated enormous press coverage and government response. Armed men walked into that restaurant and took both brothers, kidnapped them. Right there in a tourist city in broad sight of the criminal world that assumed El Chapo's sons were untouchable. We know cartels take rivals all the time, but this, nah. This was different, in a way that registered like an earthquake through organized crime networks across Mexico. El Chapo's sons. The men who carried the most powerful cartel surname in the world, grabbed off their chairs like ordinary targets. The assumption that had protected cartel royalty for years, that certain names carried a kind of immunity that transcended organizational rivalries, was shattered in one night in Puerto Vallarta. They were held for several days. The full details of what happened during that period have never been publicly confirmed, but they were eventually released. What reporting at the time and subsequent analysis suggests is that their release required negotiation at the highest levels of cartel leadership. Figures with the standing and credibility to make binding commitments were involved in securing their freedom. The incident intensified what was already a serious rivalry between Sinaloa and the CJN into something approaching open warfare, with both organizations fighting for territory across multiple Mexican states throughout the late 2010s in conflicts that produced some of the worst cartel-related violence in the country's recent history. For El Alfredillo personally, the Puerto Vallarta kidnapping appears to have been a turning point. A man who has been taken and held understands his own vulnerability in a way that cannot be taught through any other experience. After that night, according to the trajectory visible in reporting and government documentation, he became considerably more careful, more disciplined about where he went and who knew about it, more invested in the kind of layered mountain security infrastructure that makes him so extraordinarily difficult to find today. The kidnapping did not break him, it educated him. And what it taught him was that the mountain, the real mountain, the physical Sierra Madre with its impossible terrain, its loyal communities, its warning networks and escape routes, was the only security that could never be taken away. If you take the time and do your homework, you can find this pattern running through every major decision El Alfredillo appears to have made in the years following 2016. Pull back from visibility. Invest in territory. Build depth in the Sierra. Let your brothers be the faces of the organization, while you become the ghost who runs its operational backbone from inside the mountains. And now here is what that mountain empire actually looks like, according to investigative reporting, government documentation, and the assessments of people who study this organization. The Sierra Madre Occidental stretches approximately 1,250 kilometers along the western edge of the Mexican plateau, running through Sonora, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, Durango, Nayarit, and Zacatecas. Parts of this range contain canyon systems deeper than the Grand Canyon. Dirt roads wind through terrain where elevation shifts thousands of feet within a few kilometers. Communities in the deepest valleys have historically had minimal contact with the Mexican federal government. Schools, hospitals, and public services are scarce. The economy that has sustained these communities for generations is built in significant part on agriculture. And in the Golden Triangle, agriculture has always meant poppy and marijuana alongside legitimate crops. El Alfredillo's territorial control in this region, according to U.S. government sanctions documentation and reporting by Mexican security journalists, including those at Rio Doce, the Culiacan-based newspaper that has covered the Sinaloa cartel more closely than any other outlet, is exercised through a network of assets that serve operational purposes first and personal comfort second. Safe houses distributed throughout the territory, not rented apartments, but purpose-built structures with defensive architecture, redundant escape routes, and communications equipment built in. Fortified ranches that function as operational centers, livestock operations, and secure meeting facilities simultaneously. Clandestine airstrips, some paved, some graded dirt, used to move personnel, cash, and equipment through terrain where road travel would take hours. Armed security teams that patrol access routes and maintain observation on every road that leads toward the operational core of the territory. Surveillance systems built on a combination of electronic monitoring and human informant networks that reach into every community in the area. The road network of the Sierra is itself a critical operational asset. The backcountry is crossed by a web of dirt tracks, many of them built or maintained specifically to serve agricultural and cartel operational purposes that do not appear on commercial maps. These roads are not passable in the rainy season to ordinary vehicles. The cartel moves in pickup trucks that have been specifically modified for this terrain. Reinforced suspensions, oversized tires, armor plating, and in some cases, mounted weapons. Navigating these tracks requires knowledge that comes only from years of operational experience in specific terrain. That knowledge, accumulated across generations in El Alfredillo's family, is itself a form of security. The human intelligence warning system is what makes military raids consistently arrive too late. When a Mexican army convoy departs from a garrison in Culiacan, it passes through communities where residents, either willingly or under varying degrees of coercion, communicate its movement to cartel security teams. By the time that convoy, has driven 2 or 3 hours into the mountains. Its destination and estimated arrival time are known to the people protecting the territory it is headed toward. Former Mexican military officials have spoken to journalists on background about this problem, describing it as one of the most fundamental operational challenges of any sustained effort in the Sierra. You cannot operate covertly in a landscape where every community is a node in the enemy's intelligence network. Let's talk about what El Alfredillo's empire actually looks like in concrete terms, because this is the part that most coverage skips over entirely. People say he owns a mountain and leave it at that as if it is a metaphor. It is not entirely a metaphor. The ranches first. Across the Sinaloan Sierra and the lower foothills leading toward Culiac, law enforcement and investigative journalists have documented the existence of luxury ranch properties associated with Los Chapitos that serve simultaneously as working cattle and horse operations, secure residential compounds, and operational facilities for cartel business. These are not simple shacks or rustic hideouts. Some of them, based on descriptions in reporting by Mexican investigative outlets, are substantial compounds with main houses, guest quarters, stables, garages, generator facilities, communications equipment, and perimeter security infrastructure. They look from the air like successful agricultural properties. On the ground, they are something more complex. The access roads are controlled. The workers know who comes and goes. And the people who live and work there understand what kind of place it is. The aircraft. Reports connected to Los Chapitos reference ownership or use of multiple private aircraft, ranging from small single-engine planes that can operate from the short clandestine airstrips scattered through the Sierra to larger turboprop aircraft capable of longer journeys. Aircraft are critical to cartel operations in mountain territory for reasons that go beyond simple luxury. A flight that takes 45 minutes eliminates a 6-hour drive on treacherous mountain roads that could be observed, followed, or blocked. Aircraft also enable the rapid movement of cash, which is the cartel's fundamental logistical challenge, getting billions of dollars worth of American currency from U.S. drug markets back to Mexico in a form that can be used. Bulk cash does not fly commercially. It flies privately, on aircraft, on the organization's own schedule, on routes that cross the border at points and altitudes chosen to minimize detection. The vehicles. Los Chapitos have been associated in reporting with armored SUVs, the kind of serious military-grade vehicle armor that stops rifle rounds, not the decorative reinforcement sold to wealthy civilians, as well as large fleets of pickup trucks modified for the Sierra terrain. High clearance, reinforced suspensions, oversized off-road tires, sometimes with mounted weapon platforms in the bed. These are not show vehicles. They are work vehicles for a specific and demanding work environment. The horses are worth talking about, 'cause they are part of the story in a way that gets dismissed as narco-culture decoration when it is actually something more substantive. In the Sierra Madre, horses are not just a lifestyle symbol. They are a practical operational asset in terrain that defeats vehicles. Certain trails and passages in the deep backcountry are accessible only on horseback or on foot. A man who wants to move between specific locations in the Sierra without generating any electronic signature, no vehicle, no radio, no phone, rides. The cartel's relationship with horses in Sinaloa is cultural, yes, reflected in the corridos and in the equestrian traditions of the ranching communities, but it is also functional. Reports of expensive thoroughbreds, prize quarter horses, and specialized breeding operations associated with cartel figures in Sinaloa are consistent and long-standing. The cattle operations tied to cartel figures in Sinaloa are not merely fronts in the simple sense that word implies. They are genuine agricultural operations that also serve as financial mechanisms. Cattle can be moved between ranches, sold at market, transported across state lines, and converted into cash through legitimate agricultural commerce in ways that paper money cannot be. A herd of cattle represents stored value that can be liquidated when needed, moved through legitimate channels, and documented with paperwork that provides cover for the movement of value. The cartel's integration into legitimate agricultural economies in Sinaloa is one of the features that makes its financial operations so difficult to fully untangle from the surface. Beyond the mountain territory itself, El Alfredillo and Los Chapitos are connected in reporting and court documents to a broader portfolio of assets. Luxury ranches in lower Sinaloa accessible by controlled roads, used as meeting facilities and residences. Private aircraft, ranging from small single-engine planes suitable for clandestine airstrips to larger turboprop aircraft used for longer movements. Armored SUVs and customized trucks. Communications equipment, encrypted radios, satellite phones, devices designed to avoid signals intelligence collection. Significant cash reserves in multiple currencies move through financial facilitators across Mexico, the United States, China, and other countries. And the proceeds generating infrastructure itself, the fentanyl laboratories, the pill pressing operations, the precursor chemical storage, all of it tucked into the secure mountain territory and administered by trusted operational managers who report up through a chain that ultimately reaches El Alfredillo. The financial scale of what he allegedly commands is staggering in the most literal sense. The DIA has assessed the Sinaloa cartel's annual revenue in the billions of dollars. Precise figures are inherently uncertain, given that the organization does not file tax returns, but congressional testimony, federal court documents, and government reports consistently describe an organization generating revenue comparable to the GDP of a small nation. How does that money move? Bulk cash generated by American drug sales, 20s, 10s, 5s, accumulated by street-level distribution networks across dozens of U.S. cities, needs to return to Mexico in usable form. Bulk cash smuggling operations move physical currency across the border concealed in vehicles and shipments. Financial networks including money service businesses, shell companies, real estate transactions, and trade-based laundering schemes convert dirty cash into manageable assets. Wire transfers, cryptocurrency transactions, and correspondent banking vulnerabilities are all exploited. The network of financial facilitators spans multiple countries and represents, in itself, a parallel criminal economy of substantial scale. Now listen closely, because what I'm going to say next brings the whole picture together. Because while all of this was being built and consolidated, the other members of Los Chapitos were falling one by one, which is precisely what makes El Alfredillo's continued freedom so significant. Ovidio Guzman Lopez, El Raton, was arrested in Culiacan in January 2023 in a military operation that was considerably better executed than the 2019 attempt that produced the Culiacanazo. The cartel responded with violence, roadblocks across Culiacan, burned vehicles, armed confrontations with soldiers, but this time the Mexican government held the arrest. Ovidio was extradited to the United States in July 2023 and faces federal charges in Chicago, including drug trafficking and money laundering conspiracy. Then in July 2024, something happened that nobody in the cartel world saw coming. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Güero, arrived in the United States alongside Ismael Zambada Garcia, El Mayo, the co-founder and longest-serving senior leader of the Sinaloa cartel. El Mayo had evaded capture for 30 years. He was widely considered the most operationally disciplined cartel leader in Mexican history. He landed in an aircraft in New Mexico and was immediately taken into federal custody. The story that emerged in subsequent reporting and legal filings was that Joaquin had somehow lured El Mayo onto that aircraft under false pretenses, that what El Mayo believed was a meeting turned into a one-way flight to American custody. Whether that is exactly what happened and what Joaquin's motivations were remains genuinely contested and deeply complicated. But the result was unambiguous. El Mayo, age 76, was in a federal courtroom in Chicago, and the Sinaloa cartel exploded into internal warfare between factions loyal to El Mayo and factions associated with Los Chapitos, producing violence in Sinaloa that Mexican media described as some of the worst the state had seen in years. Through all of this, Ovidio captured Joaquin in American custody under circumstances that made him deeply suspect to everyone in the cartel world. El Mayo taken after 30 years of successful evasion, El Alfredillo has remained free. And here is the part that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely striking when you think about it clearly. Ivan Archivaldo, the eldest Chapito, remains a fugitive like El Alfredillo, but the internal Sinaloa war has forced a reorganization of alliances and territories that has made his position less stable than it was before 2024. The cartel factions loyal to El Mayo have been fighting Los Chapitos with an intensity that has produced hundreds of deaths in Sinaloa in a remarkably short period. Entire communities in the Sinaloan foothills have been displaced. Gunmen aligned with both sides have conducted targeted killings and kidnappings against each other's people across the state. It is the kind of internal war that historically destroys criminal organizations from within even more effectively than law enforcement does from outside. And yet El Alfredillo, according to the best available reporting and government documentation, remains operational in his mountain territory, not just surviving, but directing. The Sierra has insulated him from the worst of the valley level, fighting in ways that reflect the strategic wisdom of having built his power base in terrain that is inherently defensible and inherently difficult to project force into from outside. His enemies in the Zambada faction face the same geographic challenges that government forces face when trying to operate in the Sierra. Attacking him there requires knowledge, preparation, and resources that his mountain-based adversaries do not have in the same concentration that he does on his own ground. Operating from his mountain territory, apparently more insulated from the organizational chaos than any of his brothers precisely because his power base was never primarily organizational, it was always territorial, and territory built into the Sierra Madre Occidental over decades cannot be arrested, cannot be extradited, and cannot be shaken by factional warfare in the flatlands. According to multiple sources including DIA reporting and Treasury documentation, El Alfredillo today lives a life shaped entirely by survival logic. Every comfort, every convenience, every ordinary feature of daily life that most people take for granted. A consistent address, a regular schedule, a phone you keep for more than a few weeks, a circle of friends that extends beyond a small group of deeply vetted loyalists. All of it is gone. In its place is a regime of constant movement and constant vigilance that people who have studied fugitive cartel leaders describe as psychologically and physically exhausting in ways that eventually grind people down, even when the external security holds. He moves between locations on schedules that are deliberately unpredictable, not just day to day but hour to hour when operational circumstances require it. A location that was safe yesterday becomes a question mark as soon as any variable in the security picture changes. A new face in a nearby community, a phone call that came from an unusual number, a government aircraft spotted in a flight path it does not normally use. Each of these triggers a reassessment. Each reassessment can trigger a move. His security detail rotates personnel and positions to prevent the kind of long-term pattern development that persistent surveillance could exploit. The men around him are not just guards, they are a living early warning system, and their effectiveness depends on discipline and attention that has to be maintained around the clock. His communications reflect lessons learned from watching cartel leaders get caught through electronic intercepts for decades. The DIA and NSA have been extraordinarily effective at exploiting cellular communications, encrypted messaging applications, and satellite phone traffic to build targeting packages against cartel leaders. El Alfredillo's organization has adapted. Sensitive meetings happen in person, in locations chosen at short notice, with devices left behind. Couriers physically carry messages for the most critical operational communications. Encrypted radios on rotating frequencies handle tactical coordination within the security team. Devices used for any external communication are changed frequently enough to prevent persistent tracking. All of this adds operational overhead that slows decision-making and limits the span of control any individual can exercise. But it is the price of being the last major Chapito still breathing free air, and he appears to have concluded it is worth paying. The social world of a man living this way is also profoundly constrained. The large public gatherings that other wealthy and powerful men use to demonstrate status and build relationships, the parties, the restaurants, the public events, are entirely off the table. Every gathering is a security vulnerability. Every new person introduced into any social context is a potential informant or a potential threat. The result is a social existence built around a very small circle of people who have been tested over years and whose loyalty has been demonstrated in circumstances where betrayal would have been possible. Trust in the cartel world is not given. It is earned through accumulated history and occasionally through the specific kind of proof that comes from having had opportunities to betray someone and having declined them. El Alfredillo's inner circle, by the logic of this environment, is almost certainly smaller than most people would imagine for a man commanding billions in criminal revenue. The $10 million reward the U.S. government has placed on him is not symbolic. It is a recognition that the operation he allegedly commands is actively killing Americans at a scale that puts him in a category of threat that the U.S. government treats as a national security priority rather than simply a law enforcement matter. The counterfeit pills his organization allegedly produces are designed to look like legitimate medications. M30s pressed to look like prescription oxycodone, bars that look like Xanax, pills that look like Adderall. The people who buy them often have no idea what they contain. When the dosage is inconsistent, which with illicitly produced fentanyl it frequently is, they die without warning. A quantity of fentanyl, smaller than a few grains of salt, is enough to kill an adult. The industrial-scale production attributed to the organization El Alfredillo helps lead is, in the assessment of the U.S. government, one of the primary drivers of the worst drug mortality crisis in American history. And here is something no one actually talks about when they cover this story. While law enforcement has made genuine progress, Ovidio extradited, El Mayo in custody, dozens of financial facilitators and logistics managers arrested across multiple U.S. cities, American overdose death numbers have not meaningfully declined. The fentanyl keeps coming. The supply chain has been disrupted at specific nodes, but not broken at the source. Which means El Alfredillo's mountain empire, whatever pressure it is under, is still producing, still moving product, still functioning at sufficient operational capacity to maintain the supply reaching American streets. The only question left to answer right now is whether the internal Sinaloa war triggered by El Mayo's capture, the loss of Ovidio, the removal of Joaquin, and the ongoing DIA pressure fundamentally changes El Alfredillo's strategic position, or whether his particular form of power, rooted in physical terrain and generations of community relationships rather than organizational hierarchy, actually makes him the most durable of the Chapitos, precisely because so much around him has already been destroyed. The broader U.S. legal architecture targeting El Alfredillo is worth spelling out, because the scope of it reflects how seriously the American government treats his alleged role. The indictments against him from the Southern District of New York charge him with drug trafficking conspiracy involving fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, as well as related money laundering charges. These are not symbolic charges. They carry mandatory minimum sentences and, if he were ever extradited and convicted, would result in decades in federal prison with no realistic possibility of release. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated him under the Kingpin Act, which means any U.S. person or institution that does business with him or his designated associates is subject to criminal penalties. This designation also signals to financial institutions and governments globally that he is a priority target and has practical effects on the ability of his organization to move money through legitimate financial infrastructure. The DEA has run multiple operations specifically targeting Los Chapitos' financial networks, resulting in arrests of money laundering facilitators in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Phoenix. Mexican federal operations coordinated with American intelligence have seized weapons caches, vehicles, and communications equipment in Sinaloa. The cumulative effect of these operations has imposed real costs on the organization: key personnel lost, logistics disrupted, financial networks partially dismantled. But the organization keeps operating, which tells you something important about its depth and resilience. An organization that can lose a senior figure, rebuild around the loss, and continue generating product at scale is not fragile. It is institutionally robust in a way that reflects decades of deliberate organizational design. Other law enforcement agencies around the world are watching this situation. European authorities who track fentanyl's expansion into their own markets. Asian governments monitoring the precursor chemical supply chains. DEA country offices across Latin America watching how the post-Chapo Sinaloa cartel evolves under this kind of sustained pressure. They are all trying to understand whether what El Alfredillo represents, a form of cartel power so embedded in a specific geography that it resists the decapitation strategies that have disrupted other organizations, can actually be defeated using conventional law enforcement tools. So far, the evidence suggests it cannot. At least not quickly. At least not easily. The Sierra Madre Occidental has kept its secrets for a long time. Communities in those mountains have watched governments come and go. Law enforcement campaigns surge and recede. Cartel leaders rise and fall, and have maintained the kind of accommodation with power that isolated, economically marginal communities anywhere in the world develop when the state cannot or will not provide security and opportunity. Those communities are not simply cartel collaborators. They are people navigating hard conditions with the options they have, but their presence and the generational relationships the Guzman family has built with them is a significant part of what makes El Alfredillo so extraordinarily difficult to find and capture. He has disappeared into those mountains, at least for now. But the DEA agents, the federal prosecutors, the Mexican military commanders, the Treasury analysts, the intelligence officers on both sides of the border, none of them think his story is finished. The indictments stand. The sanctions stand. The $10 million reward stays posted every single day. And every day it stays posted without being claimed is another day that the fentanyl supply chain his organization allegedly runs continues to operate, and another day that Americans die from it. And here is something no one actually talks about when this story gets covered in mainstream media. The narrative around cartel leaders almost always centers on the drama of the chase, the raids, the captures, the dramatic courtroom moments. What gets less attention is the grinding, unglamorous reality of what it means for American families when the chase goes on for years without resolution. Every year, El Alfredillo remains free, and the organization he allegedly commands continues operating, is another 100,000-plus American overdose deaths. Another generation of communities hollowed out by addiction. Another wave of parents burying children who bought a pill they thought was something else. The $10 million reward is not a bounty in the Old West sense. It is the U.S. government's public acknowledgement that conventional law enforcement tools have so far been insufficient and that they need help from inside the information environment surrounding this man. It is an admission of how hard this is. The mountain keeps its secrets. But the people hunting El Alfredillo know something that matters. Every cartel leader who ever lived in those mountains eventually came down from them one way or another. El Chapo came down. El Mayo came down. The question is not whether El Alfredillo's time will come. The question is only how long the mountain can keep him hidden, and how many more names get added to the American overdose statistics before it does.